Hello. Hi, I'm Robert Sellers. I'm the Vice Provost for Equity and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer at the University of Michigan. It is my great pleasure today to be the active moderator for this exciting session on empowerment or burden issues of Chief Diversity Officers in the arts world. In the corporate world, as well as academia, CDO roles have exploded within the last decade as a function of society's recognition of inequities and inequalities. This explosion has also begun to occur within arts based organizations, including music schools and conservatories. Today's conversation with a very distinguished panel will examine the following issues. One, we'll look at the importance and essence of these chief diversity officer roles and their positions. Second, we'll talk about strategies and approaches that can be used to address the myriad challenges and opportunities to make systemic changes within these organizations. And then finally, we'll discuss the unique position that the CDO role occupies within an organization and how do individuals navigate it in ways that are successful not only for the organization, but also successful for themselves. We hope to have a very interactive, organic conversation today, and we would very much like to invite you to be a part of this conversation. So, as we begin, we'd love for you to please add questions within the ballroom and utilize the Q&A section of the ballroom to include your questions. And we'll incorporate the questions along with other questions that we have in our space. So, in order to maximize our time, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time introducing the panel. You can find out more about each panelist by looking at the bios. But I am going to start off by having each panelist introduce themselves in some ways by addressing the very first question. And that very first question is to describe who you are and how you came to be in the CDO position. Our panelists include Ugochi Onyeukwu, who is the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the New York Philharmonic; Christina Salgado, who is the Assistant Dean of Diversity at NYU Tisch School of the Arts; and Marcia Sells, Chief Diversity Officer at the Metropolitan Opera. So, again, starting off with our first question, describe who you are and how you came to be in the Chief Diversity Officer position. We're going to start off with Ugochi, if you would take it away.
Sure. I'm so happy to join you all today. I have worked and studied mostly in the nonprofit sector for over a decade. No, no direct arts background. However, I have been primarily focused in the nonprofit sector around diversity, equity, and inclusion, change management, and engagement building of community. So that's how I come into this work.
Great. Christina, how about yourself? Please introduce yourself.
Sure. So I actually began as a dancer. I'm trained in classical ballet and modern and studied through college. I went to George Mason University. And following that, a lot of my positions were really in the community engagement sector. And I worked for some nonprofits and really looking at ways in which I could connect with communities, specifically those who are underrepresented, and provide access. From there, I really got more engaged in the work and became more of an active contributor following my position at Pittsburgh Ballet Theater, where I ran their education and community engagement programming. Then I took a role at Juilliard, where my focus solely was equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging. And now I'm about 2 weeks into my new position at NYU Tisch. So I really come to this space with lived experiences as a Latina who grew up dancing, but then also really being about community building and finding ways in which we can support students, faculty, and staff.
Wonderful. Marcia.
Hi, thank you. Very nice to be here and among this panel and to meet so many people. How I would say this particular job, just as I'll start with a summary before even talking about my career, actually brings together all the things that I've done in a career all together in one space, in one role. And it has also placed me literally 2 blocks away from where I graduated from high school at the Professional Children's School. So I came to New York City to join the Dance Theater of Harlem back in the 70s and was still, as I said, finishing high school. I started off, I'm another dancer, started off at the age of 4 in a ballet school in Cincinnati, Ohio, where I was the only Black child in the ballet program, but then advanced, got to, join the company in Cincinnati. And during that time, Arthur Mitchell, who was starting a ballet company back in 1969, the Dance Theater, saw me when I was young and started inviting me to come to their summer program. So actually had a career as a dancer and a ballerina. And then, as figuring out life, decided to go to college, went to Barnard, went to Columbia Law School after that, because I always knew that after dance, law was probably my next thing because I'm too scared of blood to be a doctor. So from that, actually practiced law. I was a prosecutor trying rape and child abuse cases in Brooklyn. I became a dean of students at Columbia Law School, where I would say the beginning of the actual intentional work about how do you create spaces for diversity and create belonging. Worked in human resources at the National Basketball Association and Reuters, and then came back to Columbia University, where for 13 years was working in government and community affairs. And my last 2 years, I was the associate dean for outreach for the School of the Arts. But again, community building, doing work. How do you connect people to programs and to opportunities and the information that a university has? And then honestly went back to being a dean of students up at Harvard Law School, where a lot of the work around and a whole new generation of law students from those that I had met in the 90s were talking about, how do we begin to push forward around issues of belonging and diversity, and not just by numbers, but, from the real standpoint of what does it look like to have people engaged and participating and developing what diversity looks like, along with language, even the things that we have now where we're talking about pronouns and using them and thinking about how you bring in not just diverse people, but everybody can come with their whole selves. And the next thing I saw an ad for the Metropolitan Opera's chief diversity role, which I'm the first person to have this role. And of course, I think like a lot of organizations, Robert, you were talking about corporations developing these positions. A lot more arts organizations and corporations were developing these positions following the murder of George Floyd. It became a catalyst for those organizations, as well as for artists and particularly artists of color who had felt left out. But the Met had been doing, I'm fortunate to come here, and the Met had been doing a lot of work. So there were some foundations to build on. So that's how I arrive in this role, and a little bit about who I am.
So could you tell us a little bit about the role and sort of what are your responsibilities? Who are you working with? What does success look like for you?
Oh, wow. Those are big. You want me to answer? So
sure. Let's start
Okay.
off with you, and then we'll go to Ugochi and then Christina.
I am at the assistant general manager level. So that means I report directly to the general manager, Peter Gelb. which I think is also critical to be reporting to the person leading the organization. But I get to be in community with the other assistant general managers who are working on media and marketing, artistic, our HD. So hearing what's being developed, what works are coming up, as well as shaping the hiring policies and practices, thinking about what are the things we do to onboard people and create opportunities for them to feel connected, understanding the relationship between what we call administrative staff and our union staff, which includes our musicians, our chorus and actors, our stagehands. How do all of those groups work together, and there are issues around diversity in each of those areas. And human resources reports into me, which was something that I'd asked for. It hadn't been part of the plan, but having had the knowledge of what it means to run human resources and the kind of work that happens there helped to inform my thinking there. Which means you have the opportunity to think about what are the policies and procedures, how you bring people on, how you hire, how you create diverse recruiting practices. I literally get to do and see everything that happens, and I'm not responsible for making them all happen, and I certainly don't pick singers or the operas, but I am there and engaged in the conversation about both how we bring new stories, how we bring new people to tell those stories, and how we bring new audiences in to see this work and how we're creating a diverse space.
Okay. Ugochi, tell us about your position. And I know that you're relatively new in the position. What are your responsibilities and focus?
Sure. So, as the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the New York Phil, I am primarily focused. When we went into this work, we were focused on the cultural integration of diversity, equity, inclusion all throughout the institution. So I have been working alongside different stakeholder groups. So that's staff, the orchestra, and the board to push these efforts forward. And so that's who I work with. I'm on the senior management team. So I'm right there with the senior leaders of our organization, as well as bringing in individuals from these different stakeholder groups to drive the work and to make sure that their voices are heard. So for me, I think that success would be for me cultivating systems that embrace the multitudes of humanity in art, work, and life, and really bringing into vision what well-being and how important well-being is to this work that we're doing.
Okay. Christina, you've also started a new position that you've been in chief diversity officer positions in the past, and your position is sort of straddles both the art world and academia in ways. Tell us about the scope of your work.
Sure. So I'm really responsible specifically at the Tisch School of the Arts for shaping the goals and framework to advance the school's values of what we call IDBEA, which is inclusion, diversity, belonging, equity, and accessibility. And this is everything from developing and creating education programs for faculty to help support them in creating inclusive classrooms, collaborating with leadership to make sure we're putting support systems in place for students, being a resource to students, being a resource to staff and faculty, et cetera. I'm also responsible for really strategically looking at how these efforts are moving forward at the school and are aligned to the global inclusion office that we have that is looking at these values across the entire university. What I'm really considering all the time is, of course, community building, but really what does that like transformational change look like within an educational institution that is also, as you said, an arts institution, and what does that mean then when we're being really intentional about the programming that we're putting out and the support we're putting out. And so, I have to consider there's curriculum considerations all the way through to those support mechanisms for students in the community. So as you can probably tell, I work mainly with students, faculty, and staff. I do sit on the dean's team, and I report directly to the dean of Tisch, which I think is really important as well. There's also a structure in which there's a cabinet, and those folks are really the people can really make change, and they're a support system for me. And I'm only 2 weeks in, but that group has been incredible. I think success for me really looks like a place in which you're really incorporating IDBEA values, and it becomes a part of the mindset. So it's a natural part of the work, where it's not seen as like additive or extra or this thing on the side. And what I really hope to accomplish is that people are feeling that they're truly valued and seen, their full selves are seen, and that they feel like they can belong to this community and they can contribute in ways that are helpful to them, as well as helpful to the larger community.
Marcia, Ugochi, can you tell me a little bit about what success looks like to you? So how do you know that the work that you've done um, has been successful? What do you see in that space?
Well, I mean, from the standpoint, yeah, I realized I hadn't answered that part of the question. I mean, one, at the most, macro level, if I put myself out of a job and that we, aren't just talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, but that we're just doing it and living it, working it, that would be wonderful. Okay, so that's the larger dream. In terms of the work here, one, making sure that new people who had not thought of working at the Met in any form, not that they just had to be performers, but backstage, administrative, that there's an opportunity to work here, and that the arts also is an opportunity to make a living. I think that that's always been a challenge, in particularly socioeconomic communities where you're going to school to do what? You're going to, in the arts, so that it isn't seen as you're going to do it. And that because of this work, we are an integral part of conversations and the community, that we can bring people together around ideas and sometimes challenging issues through the work, and that we're a vital part of those conversations. That, along with all the, I see the questions too about the statistics, but I think if we're really doing the work well, then we're seen as an integral part of moving the conversation, and not just simply the needle, but I mean, really moving the conversation where how do we become a very inclusive community, country. And I do believe that the arts is an important way to do this. And an organization as large as the Met and the kind of performing work that we have done, that once we've done it here, that it has an impact and a ripple across. That would be success.
Thanks, Ugochi.
Yeah, so outside of building and sustaining the systems that embrace the multitudes of humanity and art, work, and life, I have always been taught, especially in my nonprofit training, is that when you start a nonprofit, you want it to end. You want that nonprofit to not have to do things over and over again, because you want to solve the problem that you started the nonprofit for. So also it would be to not even need a position like mine anymore, that the implementation is built in to this work of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, especially, is built into everything that we do as an institution. And also that we look like New York and that we are serving New York. We're a New York City organization. And I would like to see us look exactly like what New York City looks like, on the inside and outside, on and off the stage.
Great. So this is the one of the reasons why I wanted to circle back and make sure we answer the question about what success looks like is that one of the challenges that is often levied to chief diversity officers is how do you measure success? And one of our initial questions is asked specifically about uh, how do you keep statistics? How do you demonstrate success? And so, do you have a plan in the works, or are there things that are already built in terms of your metrics? Are you developing new metrics that are part of the way in which you track your success? Is your supervisor have some expectations with regards to what success looks like and how you'll be evaluated?
I, I'll jump in. um, I mean, there are the traditional ways of measuring, which is, quote the numbers. So we're also starting an internship program. The first time that the Met Opera has had a paid internship program. We're grateful to Bank of America for helping to sponsor this. We will bring in 15 interns starting this summer. So I also say, as a plug, please go to the Metropolitan Opera job page and you will see a link. Our applications close February 7th. But it will be important to look at both, I think, the numbers and the diversity of people who apply, because that also speaks to what we have done in terms of outreach and marketing and letting broad sections of organizations and people and schools know, not just the sort of traditional, either sometimes people will only look at conservatories or only look at Ivy League schools or top 20 schools. The key part is that we are, letting a broad number of people know about this opportunity. That will be one measure. The number of people of color and women and of diverse backgrounds who come into the program and are part of that work. And then there'll probably be the qualitative part of how they felt about their experience, that will also look at that. And I think those same metrics are ones that we can use for what are we doing in terms of outreach for other jobs. We've also been, we're engaged during our labor negotiations with AGMA, our key guild that represents dancers, the chorus, actors, asking about a DEI plan. So actually in the CBA, the collective bargaining agreement with AGMA, there is a DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion plan, and it spoke to issues around outreach, or what are we doing in terms of onboarding and how we make people feel that they can bring their authentic self to that work. All things that, honestly, when I came into this role, was hoping that that's indeed what we would do. And it's nice to have it, to start out the work right away. And senior management and the board members for the Met have been very excited, as well as things like people of color who are working in the organization. And as Ugochi said, both on stage and off stage, looking at those numbers, the EEO information, what stories are being told, whose stories are being told. Those are all ways that I think people will look at the Met and evaluate, as well as we will evaluate ourselves. And what are the new groups that we're bringing in to the opera and that come back again? Example, when we opened the season with Fire Shut Up in My Bones, just as Ugochi said, it looked like New York City, and many people who've come to the opera and been a part of the Met were, oh my gosh, it was amazingly young. It was amazingly both racially diverse. I think in terms of, people who some might not have thought have coming to the opera came. What is it? If you build it, they will come. But how do we get them back again to other programs? Those are the things that we are going to be looking at, and will help us measure how we're doing in terms of creating equity and inclusion.
Okay. So let me ask a broader question here. So how can institutions work to systematically transform themselves into becoming more diverse, equitable, inclusive, accessible? Um, what are some of the things that you feel are fundamental to systemic change? Sometimes the position deals with interpersonal um, challenges. But fundamental to the position is the notion of systemic change. And how do you feel like, or what do you do to try to focus at the systemic level?
I can jump in. I tend to think about this on a couple of levels. So first, I do think about people first, and really understanding what the different constituents that you might be working with, what might be best for engagement with them. And so in my case, I'm again really thinking about the students who are coming into the school. I'm thinking about the faculty who are teaching those students, and I'm thinking about staff who really sort of keep everything running throughout the year. So I do think about people and what is really necessary to engage them fully. And then when I'm thinking about like systemic change, is looking at that institutional level and looking at practices and policies. I think that's really, really critical. But in order for you to know how to help change those practices and policies, you have to be so connected to the people and the community, because you want to be putting things in place that are going to benefit everyone who's engaging with, your institution. So that's sort of my process. And what I tend to think a lot about, because it can feel overwhelming when you're trying to really move an institution forward, right? Like these are institutions that have had, they're rooted in tradition. There are things that have not changed for some time. And tradition is a beautiful thing, but there's also beauty in looking at how you can broaden, how you can push the boundaries. Where are there those moments where you can really impact and affect change, and use that and keep at it. You really do have to keep at it. But I do like to make sure that even when we're talking at that like systematic level, that you're still considering the people who make up those institutions, because that's really what's critical to the work.
Okay. Anyone else want to add? Well,
Yes, also, actually,
just go ahead. Go ahead.
yeah, so actually, just some of what Christina was saying really resonated with me, because I think sometimes when we're thinking about systematic change, we have to remember also in the work that we do on the ground to get to a future vision that we're all looking towards, that there are some creative tensions at play, and we have to figure out what those creative tensions are. And that's really important in this work, is figuring out why are we sticking to tradition, what is making this tradition hold so close, and how can we innovate on that, because traditions were also at one point a change, and so we have to figure out how we get to a place where we are always innovating on top of the traditions we already have.
And I think that this work is also critical because the landscape for particularly performing arts organizations, and both in terms of generation of donors, those that have been traditional, let's say traditional white European Eurocentric donors are aging, and we're not always sure that the next generation or their progeny are going to follow suit and use their resources to support the arts in the same way. So it is also a necessity for organizations to look at where are different opportunities for us to have a new donor base, new audience base. But it also means you can't just go out and say, come in. You do have to give them a reason to want to come to your programs, your institutions. That's why I say making sure that those programs and institutions speak to, and not just because of, quote, who's on the stage, but the stories, the information, as well as even the audience contextual connection resonates for people who before might not have seen themselves or felt like they were wanted at your institution. That's the work you have to do. You can't just say, we want you to come in. We do have to do the work to create programs. So programs like FIRE, or this particular season, the Met has actually had the amazing, wonderful good fortune, and that was work, to have in all of our operas, excluding Porgy and Bess and Fire, which have an African American cast, but we have had singers of color. But we have to do more to let different audiences know about those singers and those performers, as well as about the work that we're doing to connect around different stories, or how the stories that are on stage connect to various communities, that they have universal themes that can be engaged with from people from many different communities. That's the work, that we're engaged in now, that I'm definitely excited about. But that's also the work that's going to bring in a new level, a new, people who had not been approached before, to consider giving their treasure and largesse to the Met or to other opera organizations. I think the Metropolitan Opera is one of the bigger ones, but we're not alone in this conversation about where do we see the next generation for both donor and audience coming from.
So taking the points that you've made and sort of incorporating those with the questions that we've had coming in from the audience, there seems to be a theme around change and being a change agent, and running into challenges, whether it's individuals or organizational or cultural um, um, cultural momentum to maintain the status quo. What are just some of the strategies and tactics that you use when you encounter that resistance, whether it's at the individual level or at the structural level? Sort of, what are some of your go-to moves, for lack of a better word, or approaches to either individuals, and usually individuals in positions to wreck what you're trying to do? How do you address that in your experiences, in your positions?
I would say part of my approach has been to, I think Christina said it best too, is that a lot of times you also have to think about the individuals and talk to the people. And then you also can work out at a sort of larger level. But listening and having conversations with lots of different people in the organization, that's something I did right when I came in and keep doing. And you're trying to figure out those inflection points for when it's individuals of where you can make some inroads. On the systems side, it's also looking at what systems aren't creating a situation that makes it possible for people to come and, let's say, work at the Met. Example, internships, which long ago with many not-for-profits, not just arts organizations, were free, or you got for credit. Well, a lot of people cannot work in an internship if they're not paid. They need the money. So that, begins to eliminate certain socioeconomic groups, and you wind up with people who can afford to have somebody else take care of them, taking on these internships. You're not going to get a very diverse base. So now you are offering a salary, and you're offering a structure, and you're also doing the work of reaching out to communities that might not have thought, oh, there's an opportunity for a summer program at the Metropolitan Opera, or a fall or season-long opportunity, because you have both done the outreach and the advertising to go into communities that before might not have considered this an opportunity. Those are the kind of structural things that you have to get out of that comfort zone. The same as having these conversations that I think are often difficult, but necessary to talk about race, access, socioeconomic, gender identification. I think some have always thought in the arts, like, oh, of course, in the arts, they're always so open. Not so true. And I've had some conversations with people who've said, oh, when I was in conservatory or in a program, it was very diverse. But as I've gone along in my career, I've noticed that it's gotten smaller and smaller in terms of people of color, or even in the LGBT community, it's gotten smaller and smaller, or at least those who will identify, which I think for those of us who've been in the arts for, most of our lives, you might go, wow, that doesn't seem to make sense. But there's still some places where people didn't feel like they could bring their authentic self. So you have to create those systems, those programs, to break down those barriers and make people feel, oh yes, I can bring my full self to this experience, so that more people will then want to come in to the organization and institution. But that's, as I said, it does start sort of understanding individuals, and then developing policies, practice in place that apply to a larger group.
Yeah, and I can comment as well. Like you're going to experience resistance always. It's everywhere, and I think there are some key strategies I use. One thing that I tend to do a lot is I listen quite a bit. And I want to ask questions that are broad enough but are still probing, so that I can better understand where people are at, or folks are at. Because that's going to be really helpful for me as I'm sort of mapping out, who can really be a collaborator with me, who might I need to sit down with and talk to a little bit longer, and things like that. The other thing, in taking on new roles, even during my time at Juilliard and now even at Tisch, as I'm coming into a new position, I tend to rely on folks who have that institutional knowledge. So finding people who have been at institutions for quite some time, at your institution for some time, they're going to be able to give you history and background, and that's going to be so valuable. We want to know that history so you're not repeating it. It's so necessary for you to really take that in, so that then you can really assess, okay, this is maybe why we've ended up where we've ended up, and this is how I want to move this forward. So I think that's really critical. And the last thing I'll say is having people who have your back. You got to figure out who those people are, and you got to strategize. Sometimes it takes more than one voice saying the thing, and sometimes it takes you presenting it from different angles, and other times it takes you questioning and saying, okay, this is how I'm really seeing it. I see that you have this different perspective. Can we meet somewhere in the middle? Sometimes you have to negotiate. But I think knowing who has got your back is also a really important thing. Sorry to say it so plainly and simply, but I do find that that's useful.
Yeah, and when dealing with resistance, for me, I have found it very necessary to always start at the base understanding of how I approach any of these conversations, which is that diversity and inclusion are the natural thing here. Exclusion is what has been forced. And I will not debate the worth of the humanity in others. And that's a baseline. And so when you lead from there, then I try to understand what is behind all of the things that the resistance is coming from. And then I think that when you do that, when you try to figure out, when you give others the grace of understanding, then you allow yourself to see how you can, come to meet in the middle, or come to a shared understanding of how to go forward. But I always start with we do not debate the worth of our fellow human beings.
So I hear a lot about connecting with individuals. I hear a lot about understanding how the institution works and how things work, and a lot of strategizing. And also in terms of the start of our conversation, listening to the scope of the work that you have to do. How do you deal with the perception that you are able to fix all things DEI that are important to the organization, that you are somehow all powerful and are able to address things that have roots in many cases in centuries and related to a larger society, and expected to do that in by Friday? How do you address that in your work, in your approach?
I think that's a
Monday
struggle for
morning. I could do Monday morning.
Oh, Monday morning.
Monday morning. I think that's the challenge for all of us in any of these roles, not just arts organizations, anybody. And I think also given where I am just in the chronology of my life, I have seen the change because I mean, I remember being the embodiment of what is quote diversity. Um, as a black ballerina in a school where at the time when I started in 1964 taking ballet at the Conservatory of Music, by the time I'm leaving to go join the Dance Theater of Harlem in the 70s, there are other black kids because they saw me and they saw some other black people in that company. Sometimes it still feels slow, even though here we are in 2022 still talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I think you have to take the long view that it is not possible. Just I know you're being provocative by saying, when you have to make those changes by Friday, there are people who don't want to wait anymore. I remember as a dean of students at Harvard, there are students who just like, I've had enough. Make this change happen now. The reality is that there are so many moving parts in any kind of institution and program. So part of it is you also have to help a younger generation understand, where are the levers that we can make some change and even have some things happen. How do we also pick up, just as Christina and Ugochi said, pick up on the history so that we don't lose that and follow, even some of the paths and maps that some people who've been before us are showing us the way. That's some of the work we also have to do, but we have to make sure that we remember to go back to that, to look at those maps, that we're not, wandering around as if everything was brand new. I had a ancient history teacher who used to say, "There's nothing new under the sun." And it took me a while to understand what she was actually saying to me. But also, as you progress, not only in this work, but as in life, you realize, oh, yes, we have been through this path. What did we do wrong the first time? And how can we correct that? And then how can we even sometimes forge some new paths and new lanes? I think all of that is critical, but you have to take the long view and tell people we have to take the long view, because I'm about to hit a year. I other than starting the internship program and doing the outreach, I haven't, all the things that I can see in my mind and have put down on paper certainly haven't been done in 1 year. So, and that I think is also important in part of the work, how you change hearts and mind. I mean, I think Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was saying that is one of the bigger challenges. Like, when we're talking about the arc of the moral universe, it requires work to shift hearts and minds and to shift systems. And that's probably sometimes the harder piece, to shift systems. But you have to take the long view.
In order to do this work too, it's really community work, right? Like we've all said community building throughout this, or we are dedicated to the people in our institutions. And so when I'm in a situation where it might feel like everything is falling on me, I just like, my purpose is to support folks, to help them so that they can do their functions in a way that is keeping IDBEA at the forefront. And I need their brains just as much as they need mine. Like it's a collaboration. And yeah, I think that sometimes you do have to be really honest and realistic about what it's going to take to move something forward. And that can be what I call the hard truth when, you have to talk to a student and say, we agree, we are so aligned, and we want to make this change, but this is actually what it's going to take, and it's going to take all these folks coming together. And that's really critical to the work. So that's how I try to, get around this thought that, like, us three here, we're going to go into our institution and like magically wave a wand and things are going to move forward and change right away. Because it really is about, it's a network. It's about everyone taking their piece of this and their role in this, and us supporting the people as they're learning.
So I see another question, and I'm going to start off with Ugochi with this. This is, can you speak to some of the strategies for smaller organizations to establish strong DEIB leadership if there's a lack of resources for a dedicated individual in that position?
Sure. I think that it first begins with a conversation on what are the needs on that team, and where that team wants to, go forward. Figuring out the vision and values of that team, of that organization. It's a pretty easy conversation to start having. So I would always start there to figure out what your vision is going forward, what your values are, and then in a small organization that cannot have a dedicated individual, figuring out what leadership can do to better cultivate those values, or make sure that those are lived values and that you are actually working towards the vision, and what areas in the organization can take up which values, or how can our stated goals for the year, for the season, better align with our values that we have chosen for ourselves. And I think that is it takes the accountability at the top to kind of really be committed to this work, and committed to a DEIB, to push it forward and to make sure that everyone else is accountable to working towards the vision and living within the values that were stated.
Okay. Christina, Marcia, would you want to add anything? Or
The only thing I think too, just in terms of a sort of nuts and bolts, is also, probably even having a committee of a few people within the organization who this is a piece, and setting aside, like, every week, this is going to be a conversation of particular, both, as Ugochi said, what are the vision and goals and values, making sure that there are people who are at least once a week talking about that, and looking to the particular projects or programs of the institution. If it's an arts organization, if we're saying we're going to, bring in more people of color in either leadership roles or administrative roles, well, what are we doing to do that? Do we have a position open? Are we doing the outreach necessary? Have we decided that we are going to tell more stories of different people than, from the standpoint of an opera? It's not only going to be, quote, Eurocentric operas, but even if it's not Eurocentric operas, are we looking at singers of color who can go into those roles and that will present, or new ways of telling those old traditional operas or programs? I think something that Manhattan School of Music had put together, where they were requiring and I've talked to Alexa Smith, who is their person who's focused on diversity, as well as the chief of staff. They were looking at that in every single recital and program, that it had something to do or brought some information or news story of people of color or another culture. So if you have recitals, when somebody is planning their recitals, they're not all doing Sibelius and Mozart, but maybe they'll do Florence Price, or they will do a piece from William Grant Still. And that way you're expanding the work. So if you have a committee that is looking at where are the ways that we can begin to sort of create diverse opportunities, create equity, meaning giving equity and voice to new projects and programs, and saying to people, this is a way that we include those new voices. I think that's the way you begin to do that in a very sort of practical way, starting with a group that meets regularly, that has a conversation, set some goals about what that will look like.
Great. So let me jump to another question that our audience has posed, and which I think is really important in terms of thinking about this work from uh, long the long haul. The reality is this work is extremely full. It can be personally rewarding. It's challenging. It's not a 9 to 5. It's highly emotionally involved. Um, so how do you, just in a moment or two, what are the things that you do that are self-care that allows you to remain healthy, both physically as well as mentally and spiritually and emotionally in the position?
Prayer is one thing for me. I mean that quite honestly. I am the grandchild of a preacher, and spent a lot of time in church. I may not go as often, but I say that. I mean, I think for some people it may be a kind of meditation, but that for me is important. A community of people who understand the work, and as Ugochi and Christina know, I have pulled together and invited people to join in conversation and Zoom so that we can just share privately about the challenges. I think that's also part of the self-care, as well as the things I think anyone who works hard and at jobs, and when you do have family, you know, breaking out time and making sure I play tennis with my husband on the weekend, or we have a dog, so I do have to go outside every day to walk him. Those are all, I think those are all part of that practice too of self-care, of making sure that you give yourself those times, and not bring the phone. And or if you do bring the phone, you're actually listening to music or something that's interesting, or podcast, but not walking the dog and trying to read emails. I don't recommend that either, because I let my dog pull me and almost knock me down. So I just say, you thinking of those spaces where you can be present for yourself, and definitely finding a community. I think Christina was also saying, finding a community of people who have your back, or at least understand what you are going through, so that you can have that kind of conversation.
Okay. Christina?
Yeah. So I agree. I mean, I think you have to think about for yourself what you need sort of for your heart, mind, and soul. For me, that's a lot of taking mindfulness moments. I love yoga. I do things like that to really center myself. Another thing, when I'm working and I know that I'm going to have a challenging meeting, or I know that, someone might walk into my office and say they need to talk, and I know that this is going to be really emotional, is I try to build in time for myself to just process what I've heard, because, we are, sort of in the field of offering grace a lot of the time. And sometimes you have to give yourself some grace too. You're going to feel a lot of what you're hearing, and, to jump from meeting to meeting can be really challenging. So building in time for you to step away, to take a walk, to go outside and take a, breath of fresh air, although it's really cold right now, so maybe not now. But those types of things I think can be really useful. And then also having your community and finding ways to even set a boundary. I tend to read a lot for my personally, and then I also read a lot for work. And I was finding that, that was taking a lot of my time. So what I decided was, for work, I was going to listen always to audiobooks. And that was anything I had to read for work was going on an audiobook, right? And then everything I wanted to read personally, I was going to get a handheld book, and I was going to hold that book and feel that book. And that might seem silly to some, but it really helped me set a boundary for myself. And it you can't always separate your work and your, like, it's all intertwined. But sometimes those little things, like, my physical book versus my audio books, can make a big difference.
Ugochi.
Yeah, so I think that along with everything that Marcia and Christina said, I also really try to sometimes completely detach myself from the assumed importance of the job. It's sometimes you have to back away from it all and just say, wait a second, I am not a doctor. I'm not doing open heart surgery, and give yourself space to laugh at sometimes the almost ridiculous nature of the work, and kind of just laugh, like find times for joy, and find times for peace, is one of the really important things for me to do. Just detach. The work is important. I'm not saying that it isn't, but sometimes you have to detach yourself from that, and know that you have a life outside of that work, and to remember to uh, embrace that and hold that close, because that is what you're bringing into the work. So you have to make sure that your life is at a place of stability first.
This is a lot of really good advice, and some I wish I had learned many years ago, um, but we'll definitely take to heart. I hate to say this, but we're getting near to the end of this wonderful conversation. And what I'd like to do is to wrap up with each of you taking no more, I'm sorry, but no more than 1 minute to just answer this one final question or thoughts. Or what advice would you give for someone who is interested in working as a chief diversity officer within an arts-based organization? So 1 minute. Why don't we start off with Marcia?
Um, I would say find that organization where your passion is, um, where you're passionate about it will help. And I think, do some homework about the people, both the board and the senior level staff, as well as the people working on the ground, those who are in um, um, lower level positions or different level positions, to really understand that organization, to give you a sense of how it's not just about how committed, but how much do the people at the junior levels think that this effort around DEI, um, how much do they think that the organization is really ready for it and wanting to move it forward? That will give you some answers about whether or not this is the right role for you.
Okay, Gochi.
I would say, I don't know, Godspeed. No, I'm, I'm kidding. No, I would honestly say that, just like Marcia, find uh, make sure that there's a passion somewhere, in either the organization, the institution, or the work, that will sustain you as a human being, as a part of the organization, but also as a individual of the society. So to make sure that you're actually doing this for a passion, and not a project, because the project will not you will not last if you only think of it as a project. It needs to be something that you're passionate about in some way.
Okay, Christina.
Yeah, I think that I agree with everything that has been said, and I would think a lot about what's the potential, and how does that align to what you feel you can bring to the table, and how do you imagine sort of collaborating with those folks? you want to meet as many people, I think, as possible in those processes when you're deciding if this is the, right place for you, and how best to, what's the value add, right? Like, that's what I like to think about.
Great. This has been a wonderful panel. I wish we had more time. There are lots and lots of things that we could get through. I want to thank the audience for their wonderful questions. I hope we got to as many of those as possible. And I just wish you a wonderful day and take care. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Bye-bye.